"Hey, you, what are you doing here? Get off that bench." The command was sharp and instantly aggressive, cutting through the afternoon quiet. Officer Becker stood over Desmond, a blind black man sitting alone near the affluent Willow Creek district, demanding to know his business. Desmond remained calm, explaining simply that he was waiting for the public bus at the designated stop. But Becker wasn't interested in the truth. He dismissed Desmond with a sneer, implying that the transit for his type didn't run in this area, immediately labeling him a criminal and ordering him to stand. The confrontation violently escalated when Becker spotted the outline of Desmond's folded cane. He bellowed a command to show hands, treating the simple mobility aid as a hidden weapon. Panic surged through Desmond as he begged the officer not to shoot, frantically revealing that the object was merely his cane, and that he was blind. Becker, driven by prejudice, ignored the desperate plea. He sneered, accusing Desmond of lying about his disability and twisting his compliance into giving orders. The heavy metallic snap of the handcuffs was definitive, silencing Desmond's cries for help. Becker announced the charges: loitering, resisting arrest, and the chillingly explicit illegal assembly in a white zone. To justify this baseless arrest, Becker loudly fabricated a report, claiming Desmond was the suspect from a recent robbery and had attempted to flee. He quickly grabbed his radio, calling for his superior, Lieutenant Hayes, to report the capture of the non-compliant suspect. The lie was now official, setting the scene for the intervention that was about to arrive. "Hi, my beautiful family. Let's start with a blessing. Dear Lord, I ask you to surround every person watching with peace, healing, and endless love. Amen. You are not just an audience. You are my family, the reason I push through on the hardest days. For those who are new here, welcome to the family. Please subscribe, say hello in the comments, and let's grow closer together. Each story I bring is my sacrifice and devotion. When you walk away early, it feels like my heart is left unheard. Please, stay with me through the journey until the very end. I love you always. Now let us begin." Becker refused to acknowledge a single word of Desmond's calm, rational explanation about waiting for the bus. His hostility only intensified, fueled by an assumption of guilt rooted in prejudice. He had already made up his mind the moment he saw Desmond on that bench. When his gaze fixed on the bulge of the folded cane, Becker's mind immediately dismissed the possibility of a mobility aid. He saw not a disabled man, but a threat, a criminal attempting to conceal a weapon. In his skewed reality, the cane transformed into a concealed baton, a dangerous club, further proof of Desmond's supposed illicit activities in this privileged district. Desmond's voice, which had started firm, became a desperate plea. He begged the officer not to shoot, his fear palpable, frantically clarifying that the object was merely the tool that allowed him to navigate a world he couldn't see. He repeated the essential truth: "I am blind." But this vital fact, which should have immediately diffused the situation, was weaponized against him. Becker sneered, twisting Desmond's efforts to clarify the situation into a challenge of authority. He accused Desmond of lying about his disability and of giving orders to an officer, turning Desmond's vulnerability into a procedural violation. In Becker's eyes, Desmond was not a victim of a sight impairment. He was a master of deception, using his condition as a shield. The officer's refusal to see the cane as anything other than a dangerous instrument locked the narrative firmly onto the path of injustice. Desmond was now detained, not for a crime, but for the unforgivable sin of being the wrong person in the wrong place, equipped with an object Becker decided was a threat. Becker was done listening to the protests of the man before him. The moment Desmond had confirmed his identity as a target, black, and now suspiciously claiming disability, Becker moved. The officer lunged forward, grabbing Desmond roughly. The movement was a violent violation, especially for a man who could not see the attack coming. Desmond cried out in confusion and pain, his body tensing against the unexpected physical assault. The metal of the handcuffs snapped shut on his wrists with a brutal finality, the sound echoing the sudden loss of his freedom. As Becker wrenched Desmond into an agonizing position, the veneer of professionalism crumbled entirely. He hurled a stream of derogatory, racist slurs, stripping Desmond of his dignity while physically restraining him. Every word was designed to degrade and terrify. Desmond, now helpless and blind, began to yell, desperately calling out for anyone, a witness, a Samaritan, anyone, to intervene, his voice thick with fear and injustice. Becker ignored the pleas for help, using the commotion as false evidence of resistance. He slapped Desmond with charges of loitering, resisting arrest, and even illegal assembly in a white zone, officializing the racially motivated basis of the entire ordeal. Becker, already certain of his fabricated narrative, declared that Desmond was now subdued, transforming the innocent victim into a conquered suspect for his report. The immediate, high-strung tension of the scene shifted sharply as Lieutenant Hayes' patrol car pulled up. Hayes, a superior officer, stepped out, his expression instantly recognizing the grim severity and liability of the confrontation before him. A uniformed officer had a visibly distressed, handcuffed black man pinned against a public bench, all over a walking cane. Hayes didn't need a full report to know this was a potential media crisis, a procedural time bomb ticking down in his jurisdiction. He moved with a heavy, authoritative stride, demanding a rundown of the situation. Officer Becker immediately seized the opportunity to solidify his fabricated narrative. He launched into a rapid, self-serving account, painting Desmond as an aggressive, suspicious criminal. Becker's tone was defensive and urgent as he claimed Desmond had been lurking in the affluent area, refused to identify himself, and most critically, had reached for his concealed weapon, that supposedly dangerous baton, when confronted. Becker stressed that he was forced to use physical restraint to subdue the combative suspect, justifying every aggressive, racially motivated action he had just taken. Desmond, still cuffed and disoriented, struggled to interject his truth, but Becker's authoritative lies drowned out his quiet voice. Hayes listened, his face betraying nothing, taking in both the polished, false police report from Becker and the raw, terrified reality of the man in handcuffs. The lieutenant's gaze flickered between the hostile officer, the vulnerable victim, and the innocent cane lying uselessly on the ground. The on-the-spot investigation had begun. Lieutenant Hayes wasted no time dissecting the chaos Becker had created. His first priority was to cut through the fabric of lies and establish basic facts. Hayes moved past the belligerent Officer Becker and addressed the handcuffed man directly, initiating a formal inquiry. He demanded Desmond's full name and identification, necessary steps for any detention. Becker, eager to maintain his control, was forced to awkwardly retrieve Desmond's wallet from his jacket, the act itself a further humiliation of the already restrained man. Desmond, his heart still hammering from the violence of the arrest, struggled valiantly to regain his composure. Despite the physical discomfort of the tight cuffs and the paralyzing fear of being blinded and helpless before armed authority, he managed to speak with clarity. He explained his innocence in meticulous detail, reaffirming his original claim. He was simply waiting for the bus after a routine appointment. He stressed his disability, his voice conveying the profound unfairness of being treated as a violent criminal because of the aid he carried. He was aware of the immense stakes, his freedom, his dignity, and his safety, all resting on the lieutenant's judgment. He pleaded his case not with anger, but with the quiet, desperate logic of a man whose reality had been violently hijacked by an officer's hatred and prejudice. Hayes watched, weighing the sincerity of the vulnerable, cuffed man against the aggressive, self-justifying posture of his subordinate. The lieutenant had the facts, but he was still searching for the truth. Despite the humiliating handcuffs and the chilling proximity of the hostile officer, Desmond knew this was his one chance to break through Becker's narrative. He straightened his spine, using the formal inquiry by Lieutenant Hayes as his stage for defense. Desmond spoke with a controlled fury, a man forcefully arguing for his own humanity. He declared himself a law-abiding citizen, not a criminal, challenging the very foundation of Becker's prejudiced accusation. He meticulously detailed his movements that day, recounting his routine medical appointment and confirming the exact time he had arrived at the bench, movements that could be easily verified. Desmond didn't simply claim innocence. He systematically dismantled Becker's entire story. He refuted the lie that he had resisted arrest, emphasizing his inability to physically fight back, given his sight impairment and the officer's sudden, aggressive actions. He forcefully rejected the claim that his cane was a weapon, pointing out the absurdity of a blind man suddenly using his mobility aid as an offensive weapon. Every statement was a direct, logical strike against the flimsy and hateful claims of Officer Becker. Desmond's voice, though quiet, was infused with the unassailable truth, forcing Lieutenant Hayes to squarely confront the fact that his subordinate's entire motivation was rooted not in evidence, but in outright racial profiling and malice. The silence that followed was thick, hanging heavy with the weight of that undeniable truth. Lieutenant Hayes finally broke his silence. His eyes, cold and assessing, turned from Desmond to the object lying innocently on the ground, the supposed weapon. With a heavy sigh that conveyed profound irritation, Hayes bent down and picked up the cane. He examined it meticulously, turning the light, folding metal over in his hands. It was undeniably, unequivocally a standard, collapsible mobility aid, clearly designed for the sight-impaired, complete with the familiar red tip. There was no argument to be made. It was absolutely not a baton, a club, or a firearm. Hayes slowly straightened, the cane now an undeniable piece of evidence exposing the lie. He didn't shout, but his voice was a low, chilling reprimand directed solely at Becker. He didn't ask if the officer had made a mistake, but why he had deliberately ignored the truth. He sharply questioned Becker's judgment, demanding to know what about a blind man with a cane justified an aggressive public arrest. Hayes' gaze cut deep, exposing the ugly thread of implicit bias and malice woven into Becker's actions. The lieutenant forced Becker to look at the cane, forcing him to confront the simple, objective truth that completely invalidated his entire, racially motivated scenario. Becker shifted uncomfortably, his confident swagger melting into an uncomfortable silence. The mask of procedure had been ripped away, and all that remained was raw, unforgivable prejudice. The tense, charged silence following Lieutenant Hayes' cold rebuke was shattered by a sudden, urgent crackle from Becker's radio. A dispatcher's voice, frantic and clipped, cut through the air with an update on the area crime. Hayes immediately motioned for Becker to answer. The dispatcher reported a carjacking in progress, providing details on the suspect who had committed both the carjacking and the earlier robbery, the very crime Becker had used to justify Desmond's arrest. But the critical detail was the description. The actual perpetrator was revealed to be a person whose features and, most importantly, race completely invalidated Becker's actions. The confirmation was an instantaneous, absolute climax. It was the undeniable truth broadcast over the airwaves, wiping away every shred of plausible deniability Becker had desperately constructed. Hayes stood frozen, the walking cane still clutched in his hand, looking from the radio to the handcuffed, blind man, and then to the rigid, pale face of his lying subordinate. The call exposed the ugliness beneath the procedure. Becker had not made a mistake. He had engaged in blatant, deliberate racial profiling. The actual criminal was still loose, and Becker had wasted valuable time arresting a vulnerable, innocent man based solely on the color of his skin. The lieutenant's eyes narrowed with controlled fury. The case against Desmond evaporated, leaving only the sickening evidence of Officer Becker's malice. The truth, delivered by the crackle of the police radio, was too loud, too public, and too undeniable to ignore. Lieutenant Hayes reacted instantly, his face hardened with the realization of the massive ethical and legal fallout Officer Becker had just invited. With a decisive, sharp motion, he ordered the immediate release of Desmond. The cuffs came off with a final, echoing click, physically freeing Desmond from the grasp of the lie. Turning his full, chilling attention to Becker, Hayes then delivered a devastating, public condemnation. He didn't pull the officer aside. He disciplined him right there, in front of the man he had wronged. Hayes declared Becker's actions a gross procedural failure rooted in unforgivable prejudice. He announced that Officer Becker was being placed on immediate administrative leave, his career now hanging by a thread, with formal proceedings for termination to follow. The lieutenant then turned back to Desmond, his stern posture momentarily softening. He extended his hand, delivering a sincere, profound apology on behalf of the entire department for the failure, the humiliation, and the terror Desmond had endured. Hayes acknowledged the severity of the injustice, understanding that a verbal apology was barely a band-aid, but it was all he could offer. Desmond, still unsteady but visibly relieved, accepted the apology, his immediate concern focused only on his safe passage away from the site of his violation. Justice, in this moment, was swift, public, and absolutely necessary. The final act of justice was quiet, yet deeply significant. Lieutenant Hayes, having publicly disgraced Officer Becker, ushered Desmond toward his own patrol vehicle. It was an extraordinary gesture, a high-ranking officer personally chauffeuring a civilian, a symbolic attempt to restore some semblance of dignity lost moments before. Hayes helped Desmond into the passenger seat, gently placing the recovered walking cane beside him. As the car pulled away from the scene, leaving the disgraced Becker standing rigid and silent, Desmond leaned back, physically free but emotionally exhausted. He was safe, yet profoundly wounded. The cuffs were off, but the psychic weight of the injustice lingered. The raw sting of being targeted, dehumanized, and terrorized simply because of his race and his disability. He had won the argument, secured his release, and seen his aggressor punished, but the experience had reaffirmed an enduring, ugly truth. His existence in certain spaces was viewed as a crime, and his essential tools for life were treated as threats. Hayes drove in silence for a few minutes, finally breaking the quiet with a simple, genuine assurance that the department would deal severely with Becker. When they reached Desmond's correct transit stop, Hayes ensured Desmond was settled, his cane firmly in his hand. Desmond thanked the lieutenant, his voice devoid of any lingering gratitude, only relief. He walked away from the car, an innocent man returning to his life, forever changed by the brutal memory of the day his walking cane was weaponized against him. The lieutenant watched him go, knowing that the apology, however sincere, was insufficient against the weight of systemic failure. The chapter was closed, but the scar remained.